Hi there, I'm Vladistav Malashevskyy and I'm mainly a student, but I'm also a climate activist and a member of Young. In these recent months, I've participated in creating this climate social forum, and in these brief videos I will talk about Article 6 of the Paris Agreement. I took part to the COP25 last year in Madrid, and therefore I will divide these videos into a brief description of the state of the art of Article 6 before COP25. Then I will talk about what were the expectations out of COP25 and what happened there, and therefore what is happening now and what we are expecting from the next COP. Article 6 is one of the most disputed and complex points of the negotiations overall, and it's also one of the least accessible due to its complexity. This complexity was the major reason why Article 6 was not agreed until the last morning of the Paris negotiations back in 2015 and was left unresolved at the Katowice climate talks of the COP24. But before talking about the Article 6, I have to do an introduction over carbon markets. They work more or less like this. Countries that struggle to meet their emission reduction targets under their nationally determined contributions, or NDCs, or want to pursue less expensive emissions cuts, can purchase emissions reduction from other nations that have already cut their emissions more than the amount they had pledged. Therefore, if the rules are structured appropriately, the result can be a win-win for everybody involved. Both countries meet their climate commitments, and the overachiever is also financially rewarded for going above and beyond. In this framework of international carbon markets takes shape the Article 6 of the Paris Agreement. This article is structured in 9 paragraphs, and 3 of these are operational. Those are paragraphs 2, 4, and 8. Paragraph 2 provides an accounting framework for international cooperation, such as linking the emissions trading schemes of 2 or more countries. This bilateral collaboration between countries is done via the internationally traded mitigation outcomes, the so-called ITMOs. This paragraph also allows for the international transfer of carbon credits between countries. Paragraph 4 establishes a central UN mechanism to trade credits from emission reductions generated through specific projects. And finally, paragraph 8 establishes a work program for non-market approaches, such as applying taxes to discourage emissions or such as development aid. This article gives a formal framework for climate cooperation between countries where no trade is involved, being it a non-market approach. Therefore, we have paragraph 2 and 4, which relate to carbon markets, and paragraph 8, which does not. Returning back to carbon markets, what benefits could these offer if rules are designed well? Well, carbon markets are a big deal, both in terms of potential emissions reductions and the cost savings they can generate. Half of countries' initial NDCs include the use of international cooperation through carbon markets, so it's significant. According, for example, to IETA, the potential benefits to cooperation under Article 6 include cost savings of $250 billion per year in 2030. International cooperation through carbon markets can bring additional public and private finance and catalyze emissions reductions in a country hosting the mitigation activity. And for the purchasing or acquiring countries, using carbon markets enables access to a wider pool of opportunities to reduce those emissions. This might lead to higher ambition, given that mitigation can be made more cost-effective, which also provides flexibility. Anyway, there are also big risks if rules on international carbon markets are designed poorly. And it should be noticed that these risks are so important that during COP25 many parties and observers considered that no final deal on Article 6 was better than a poorly designed Article 6. Without the right rules in place, this article could actually weaken countries' NDCs and increase global emissions. There are a few ways in which this could happen. First of all, through double counting. While the Paris Agreement is clear that double counting must be avoided under Article 6, and there is a specific paragraph stating this, the extent to which double counting is actually avoided depends on how accounting rules are operationalized. And we have to notice that if emission reductions are double counted, it will potentially result in an increase in global emissions and weaken the already inadequate NDCs. Then there's the topic of additionality. The way in which Article 6 is finalized will dictate whether emissions reductions under Article 6 will be additional to what would have occurred anyway. For example, if a wind farm was already going to be built instead of a coal plant, here the carbon market shouldn't offer a climate benefit. But without guidance ensuring additionality of emissions reductions, Article 6 rules could weaken NDCs. Finally, there's a more general topic, less specific, which is related to failing to deliver increased ambition and progression. Article 6 can be designed in a way that either supports or hinders increased ambition. For example, by determining whether subsequent NDCs will be incentivized to decrease coverage of GHGs and sectors over time, and whether transfers of emissions reductions will result in greater emission cuts. Therefore, it is clear that a poorly designed Article 6 would give to countries the possibility of looking for loopholes in order not to really act in accordance with the mitigation targets. Hi, in the first video I've done an introduction to Article 6 and the international carbon markets, while in this video I will talk more in detail about Article 6 and the issues that were discussed at COP25. The most contentious issues regarding this article are mainly the following: avoiding double counting, the overall mitigation in global emissions, the share of proceeds, and finally the carryover of pre-2020 Kyoto mechanism units. Starting from the issue regarding double counting, of course countries were clearly concerned about it at COP21 in Paris. The need to avoid it is mentioned no less than 7 times in the Paris Agreement and in its accompanying COP decision. The Paris COP decision specifies that double counting in Article 6 must be avoided on the basis of a corresponding adjustment. A corresponding adjustment means that when one country sells emissions reductions to another, it must adjust its own emissions figures accordingly. In other words, it must increase its level of emissions reductions in its NDC to make up for the fact that it sold some emissions reductions to another country. Conversely, the country that purchased the credit adjusts its own emissions reduction downward. But there are several critical issues in the negotiations about when corresponding adjustments apply and how to avoid double counting. One of the largest issues that countries disagree on has to do with whether corresponding adjustments will be required from credits from specific projects under Article 6.4. For example, credits from an emissions reduction project like a wind farm could be sold to another country, and then the country that pursued the emissions reductions may choose to also apply those reductions toward achieving its NDC. If there is no corresponding adjustment, the emissions reductions of that project are counted twice. Another big issue in this point is the lack of a common timescale in the NDCs. The technical question was how to account for trade between countries with different types of NDCs, given some target and emission budget across multiple years, and others aim for a particular level in a single target year. If accounted for inappropriately, the trading under Article 6.2 could have allowed countries to meet their single-year targets without actually cutting emissions. Therefore, there are mainly two problems under this issue of double counting. The first one being the one about corresponding adjustments for projects under Article 6.4, and the second one being the one related to timescales. Then there is the second big issue of the negotiations, which is the overall mitigation in global emissions. In particular, Article 6.4 stipulates that the mechanism is to deliver an overall mitigation in global emissions, often referenced as OMG. For some parties, overall mitigation in global emissions could mean that some of the credits generated under Article 6.4 for emissions reductions are essentially taken off the table, not used toward any party's NDC. In other words, rather than transferring them between parties and allowing a buying country to count those emissions reductions toward its target, these unused emissions reductions could be set aside to provide a net decrease in global emissions. For example, if some credits were generated from a country's wind farm intended for transfer to another country, some percentage of these credits would not be applied to either the NDC of a country or a purchasing party. In this case, Article 6 would not simply be an offsetting tool in which emissions reductions are transferred from one country to another with no guarantee of additional emissions cuts beyond the NDC, but rather a tool that contributes to further emissions reductions. Also in this case, countries are divided mainly on two subtopics, subproblems. The first one being whether overall mitigation in global emissions applies only to Article 6.4 or to Article 6.2 as well. Then there is the second subproblem, which is how overall mitigation in global emissions is done in practice. For example, via discounts, cancellations, or other means. So, then there is the third big issue of the negotiations, which is the share of proceeds I mentioned earlier. Under the Kyoto Protocol, a levy was placed on trades under the Clean Development Mechanism, and the resulting proceeds were used for administrative purposes and also to replenish the Adaptation Fund, which provides support to vulnerable countries to adapt to the impact of climate change. The Paris Agreement was explicit about continuing this support for adaptation and administrative purposes under Article 6.4, trading credits from emissions reduction resulting from specific projects, but did not mention any of these in Article 6.2. So when two or more countries transfer emissions reductions through emissions trading schemes, for example. In Madrid, countries grappled with how the share of proceeds under Article 6.4 is to be carried out, and also whether there shall be or not a share of proceeds from Article 6.2 transfers to generate revenue for the Adaptation Fund. The fourth and last point I mentioned earlier is the carryover of pre-2020 Kyoto mechanism units. Another this issue is whether countries can use credit generated under the Kyoto protocol prior to 2020, which remain unused given a lack of demand. Well, a recent study estimated that there could be as many as 4 billion such units leftovers from the Kyoto Protocol, representing more or less 4 gigatons of emissions. If countries take full advantage of these credits toward achieving their their already insufficient NDCs, the world will get even further off track from reaching the goals of the Paris Agreement. So it's clear that these units shouldn't be used, but there are still many countries that are trying to get advantage from them. So in brief, these are the main issues which I discussed until now. About the problem of double counting, there is the issue on actually ensuring that there won't be any double counting thanks to corresponding adjustments, and whether these corresponding adjustments should be applied also to projects under Article 6.4. Then there is the topic of OMG, which has two sub-problems. The first one being if OMG should be applied also to Article 6.2 as well as it is applied to Article 6.4, and the second one being on how to ensure this OMG, meaning a net benefit for the atmosphere rather than simply emissions in one place being offset elsewhere. Then there is the problem of share of proceeds and if it should apply also to Article 6.2 and not only to Article 6.4. Finally, there is the problem of units from the Kyoto Protocol. There is also one big issue, which is whether to make specific reference in the rules to human rights. But I won't cover this topic now because I think it's important enough to be discussed more in depth in other places. So we all know that COP25 ended up being the longest COP ever and still without the expected results. Even His Excellency, UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres, said he was disappointed with the results and the loss of an important opportunity. This COP ended leaving open one last point of the Paris Agreement, Article 6, which is what we are talking about now. The pressure to finalize this point was really high because later on, 2020 should have been the year of the new and more ambitious NDCs, and in order to proceed on this most of the parties wanted the Paris Agreement to be ready and finalized without any issues open. We know that this Article 6 wasn't finalized, and we also know that actually COP26 didn't take place this year in Glasgow, so actually countries will have more time for their NDCs because many haven't been submitted. Okay, I will stop now and talk about the outcomes of the COP25 on these issues that I've discussed until now. So, bye. In this final video, I want to talk about how did the COP25 end and what is the situation now while we are waiting for COP26. But first I want to do some personal remarks, given the fact that I attended COP25 and what was my impression in general. I personally attended only the first 2 weeks, the first week of negotiations, so I couldn't really follow in presence till the end. but still I have some things that I think are important to say. It was clear since the beginning, even though I am not a negotiator or an expert, that there were countries trying to slow down negotiations on purpose, I would say. There was even confusion on how to describe some types of negotiations, and in an article that I've read later, this confusion was described as a roller coaster of procedural confusion. This happened after parties continued arguing over how to describe negotiations initially called get-togethers and later renamed multilateral informals with co-facilitators. I really remember this situation where they were arguing on how to consider these negotiations and how official they would have been. And yeah, it was crazy, I have to say. I also can say that as a first-time observer, you are already confused by everything happening around you, in a positive way, of course, and that's fine, but seeing negotiators trying to create confusion on purpose is frustrating. I think even for not only for us observers, but also for the others negotiators that are really trying to do their job and do something for everything. Also, one last personal memory I want to add is that I clearly remember, as on the last day that I took part to the COP, there was this important meeting scheduled regarding Article 6. Well, they moved it in both space and time a few times during the day, and not with much notice, more or less at the last minute. Later in the evening, I was waiting for this particular meeting before leaving, and it was my last day. I also had some side events which I didn't attend in order to attend to this meeting. Well, guess what? They moved it again to the night, and it also became inaccessible to observers. This was one of the many signs that negotiations weren't going as expected, weren't going well. But there still was hope. I mean, I left on that Friday that there was still hope that during the next week something would change. Well, that hope vanished day by day during the following week when ministers were there. And just to give you an idea, on the supposed last day of COP25, the Friday, on the second Friday, the one after I left, the number of open brackets on Article 6 was bigger than the corresponding at the end of COP25 negotiations. So the open brackets are the part of the text that still have to be discussed and on which there are issues. And the fact that there were more opened on the supposed last day of COP than on the last day, on the closing day of the previous negotiations gives you an idea on how productive these 2 weeks of COP25 had been. Well, the final decision taken by the parties on Sunday is the following, and I will simply read it because I think it's clear enough what it says, and I quote, the Conference of the Parties, serving as the meeting of the parties to the Paris Agreement, notes the draft decision text on matters relating to Article 6 of the Paris Agreement, prepared by the President of the Conference of the Parties, serving as the meeting of the parties to the Paris Agreement, at its second session, while recognizing that this draft text do not represent a consensus among parties. So this is the first point. Then the second one, requests the subsidiary bodies for scientific and technological advice to continue consideration on matters referred to in paragraph 1 above at its 52nd session, June 2020, which actually has been was moved to the next year, on the basis of the draft decision text referred to in paragraph 1 above, with a view to recommending draft decisions for consideration and adoption by the Conference of the Parties, serving as the meeting of the parties to the Paris Agreement at its third session. So, long story short, there was no consensus on the main issues, and it was said, let's talk about it in June, and then the next November in Glasgow. We also know that nobody actually had the possibility to talk in June in Bonn, because it was moved to... It should have been done in October, but it was moved to the next year, and the same happened to the COP in Glasgow. Actually, the remaining open issues on the last day were the Kyoto transition and double counting. But this doesn't mean that other issues won't be reopened on the next session, because the final decision of the parties, as I previously read, is that there is no consensus among parties on this draft text. So this means that unbracketed texts still could be reopened. We don't expect that, and we don't hope that this happens, but it still could happen, and so it really depends on what will happen in the next negotiations. Well, I will now cover the state of the art of the 4 main points that I discussed in the previous video. So, starting from double counting. In the near final draft, the potential pitfall previously explained, which are double counting due to different timescales and difference in NDCs types, is avoided explaining how to make these corresponding adjustments to avoid double counting. This explanation sets out several approaches to accounting which parties can choose from, such as averaging the quantity of traded emissions across all years, for example, in cases of difference of timescales. I will get now a bit in depth on exactly what happened during negotiations, because I think it's remarkable and important to underline. And the political fight on double counting centered on the application of these corresponding adjustments to international carbon trading under Article 6.4, as I said in the previous video. And although ostensibly also a matter of good bookkeeping, Brazil in particular was insistent that countries hosting emission cuttings projects under Article 6.4 ought not to be required to make corresponding adjustments when any CO2 savings were sold overseas. Brazil's position stemmed largely from one particular veteran negotiator who said that the heart of the matter was a different understanding of the meaning of an NDC, which was never clearly defined or agreed on. In his view, an NDC was made up of a set of government policies and programs rather than, as understood by many others, and I would say by most of the other parties, a particular target to cut CO2. So there is this difference of understanding and conception of the meaning of an NDC. In this case, he argued any private sector activity resulting in Article 6.4 carbon reduction was guaranteed to be additional to the NDC, since it was by definition not part of the government's own policies and programs, and therefore the NDC itself should not need adjusting. Most of other parties disagree on this Brazil's interpretation of an NDC, seeing the central question in terms of the aggregate impact on the atmosphere. From this perspective, any trade in offsets must be properly accounted for. If not, the environmental integrity could be breached, with targets being met even as CO2 emissions rise. Brazil's firm position on the question of double counting was reportedly a key factor in the failure to agree on Article 6 rulebook at COP24. As talks in Madrid moved into over time, the matter was one of several outstanding issues still holding up progress. So I want to repeat that mainly there is this difference of understanding of what an NDC is. From one perspective, I would say from what is useful to Brazil, which isn't for the atmosphere and the planet in general, is that the NDC is an agglomerate of government policies and programs, so there is no private sector involved, while the understanding of an NDC from most of the other parties is that everything should be counted. Of course, it's not that simple, but everything should be counted in order to understand the real impact on the atmosphere. So this is the main issue. Then there is the question about the Kyoto era units. So as previously said, it was a very contentious question, this one on how to deal with billions of these Kyoto era carbon offset units, potentially amounting to more than 5 billion tons of CO2 equivalent. I say potentially because another estimate, which I gave earlier, is 4 billion, so it really also depends on how we estimate them, but as we see, it's more or less around 4 or 5 billion tons of CO2 equivalent. These units were mostly generated under the Clean Development Mechanism, where projects in developing countries created certified emission reduction, CERs, in the developing world. The lion's share of these CERs were created in a handful of countries, notably China, India and Brazil. At COP25, these countries pushed for CERs to be eligible under Article 6.4, arguing that private companies had invested in good faith and should not have their assets rendered worthless. The European Union, vulnerable and other vulnerable countries were firmly against the transition of Kyoto units. They argued that CERs would undermine already insufficient ambition by allowing targets to be met with emissions reductions that have already happened, in place of additional cuts being made in the future. Some also noted that CERs are already viewed as practically worthless on the open market. In addition, a supply in the billion of tons would far exceed demand, meaning prices under Article 6 would also be low. This would also diminish the incentive for additional private sector investment in the scheme, cutting off potential financial flows to the very countries that wanted to benefit from participation in the first place. An additional source of Kyoto units is the assigned amount units, AAUs, given to developed countries with targets under the protocol, effectively permits to emit a certain quantity of CO2. For some countries, weak targets or economic collapse has led to a large surplus of these AAUs, often despite a lack of deliberate action to cut emissions. One of these countries is Australia. its amount of use would amount to more than half of the effort required for the country to meet its target to cut emissions to 26 to 28 below the 2005 level by 2030. In combination, the quantity of CRs and AAUs is so large that it could significantly weaken the current level of ambition under Paris, which is already falling far short of meeting the Paris goals. So along with the Brazilian position on double counting, Australia's stance on the carryover of Kyoto units faced harsh criticism at COP25. And in the near final draft, so let's talk about the conclusion. The near final draft of the Article 6.4 rules would have allowed the use of CRs within the Paris regime, but with vintage restriction, meaning only credits created after a certain date would be allowed. So there are a set of old CERs that would be dropped, and there are many others that would be taken in consideration. The date of this restriction was to be determined later, meaning that unless agreement was reached, then no CRs would be allowed. So at the moment there are no CRs allowed, but because there is no agreement. But the idea is in this near final draft is to consider some quantity of these CRs. Personally, I think that, given what I've said until now, it's clear that no amount of CRs should be allowed under Article 6, because it lowers significantly the ambition. But yet, countries in this near final draft have reached the conclusion that CRs created after a certain year but before 2020 will be allowed. We will see what will happen. Still don't know. However, there is also no mention to the AAUs, the ones that Australia would want in the deal. In any case, the agreed basis for resuming discussion on Article 6 on the next year in Glasgow includes earlier drafts, which still contained options to explicitly ban the use of AAUs. This issue of the pre-Kyoto units is almost certain to be reopened, and we don't know how and what will be decided. Well, then there is the issue on share of proceeds, and it's one of the more politically fraught issues, and it is around what share of proceeds from selling carbon offsets should be set aside to fund adaptation efforts in the most vulnerable countries. As I explained earlier. A further question was whether to set aside a share of proceeds also under Article 6.2 as well as under Article 6.4, despite the Paris Agreement only explicitly mentioning the idea of the latter context, Article 6.4. So this is the context which I already gave in the previous video. Securing support for adaptation via all Article 6 trading was marked down as a key priority by negotiating blocs including the African group as well as the G77 plus China. It should be noticed that the African group has interest in adaptation fund because there are many developing countries which need help for adaptation, and the G77 plus China also has interest in this adaptation fund. Many developed countries were resistant to the idea, and it's clear enough why, because they want to pay to this adaptation fund. And seeing formally seeing it as a transaction tax that would limit trade. This view caused particular issues for the US delegation, which sees tax matter as untouchable in the UN climate process if it is to avoid seeking Senate approval for any resulting deal. So in the case of US, there is this double interest, which is not involving Senate and not paying in general to the adaptation fund. The European Union also opposed the share of proceeds being applied to bilateral links under Article 6.2, which it hopes to use to link its emission trading system to others. A bridging proposal emerged on the final Friday, apparently designed to avoid this objection by encouraging or requiring, it was used the word shall, to participating in such links to provide adaptation funding indirectly rather than via Article 6.2 itself. In the near final draft on Article 6.2 only contains the weaker voluntary language where parties using the mechanism are strongly encouraged to support adaptation. So on this issue, the near final draft there was some kind of consensus, and it was that there will be no mandatory share of proceeds from Article 6.2, which is far from being ambitious, because we know that countries developing countries and many poor countries are the one that face most effects of climate change, and so actually need to adapt, and often they don't have economic resources to do so. So from my perspective, this near final draft is insufficient and probably to be reviewed, but we don't know what will happen in the next negotiation. So the final major area of Article 6 disagreement was around the idea of securing overall mitigation in global emissions, OMG, a concept introduced in the Paris Agreement text for Article 6.4, as I explained previously. OMG is supposed to ensure a net benefit for the atmosphere, rather than simply a zero-sum outcome where emissions in one place are offset by reductions elsewhere. Key questions for the rulebook included how to implement a system that would guarantee OMG, and whether or not to apply a similar scheme to trading under Article 6.2. Groups such as EOSIS argued that the only way to achieve OMG was to automatically cancel a portion of any offsets created under Article 6. They argued that applying these cancellations to trade under Article 6.4 but not under Article 6.2 would create an imbalance that could skew the market. Others opposed automatic cancellation under both mechanisms, arguing it amounted to a transaction tax that would limit the level of trade and impedes any benefits that Article 6 could bring. In the near final draft to Article 6.2, parties are strongly encouraged to cancel a portion of traded offsets to support overall mitigation. In the draft for Article 6.4, at least 2% of traded offsets would have been set aside for overall mitigation, with the exact figure decided later. So again, there is no obligation on Article 6.2. Parties are simply strongly encouraged, which means they simply can decide not to do so. And in the Article 6.4, where it is explicitly said that it's an obligation, well, the amount is 2%, which I want personally to add seems really insufficient. So as we see, these final drafts either have bracketed parts, which means they are not resolved, or simply resolve the issue by actually not resolving it, or encouraging country to do what should be done, but without any type of obligation. We also know that the Paris Agreement can be as the previous Kyoto mechanism, because we know that Kyoto mechanism failed because theoretically countries should be obliged to do some things, and if they didn't, they would be fined and so on. But this actually didn't happen. So nobody wanted the Paris Agreement to be something that imposes anything on countries, but it should be something that countries do on their will. But these texts that strongly encourage aren't enough. This is my point of view, because they don't even set some minimum, for example, percentages regarding the OMGs, and similarly on the other issues. I think that much more should be done, and that the ambition should be raised in order to really start solving this climate crisis. So we will see what happens in the COP26 in Glasgow, but as we see, in matter of Article 6, COP25 actually didn't take any strong decision, and things didn't really change from COP24. So the situation, the state of the art, is more or less the same that there was previously, and we'll see what happens. Hopefully an agreement will be reached, an ambitious agreement. I'm personally not so optimistic, but many others are, and I hope to be wrong. See you, bye.